Tonight we're celebrating the 50th anniversary of one of Richmond's great cultural treasures, the Orange Tree Theatre. The anniversary foot is being celebrated with an exhibition at another of the town's cultural treasures, the Museum of Richmond, which, as I found the other day, is well worth visiting. And we're lucky tonight to have Paul Miller, the artistic director of the theatre, and Laura Irwin, the museum's curator, to talk about the theatre's history. They're happy, indeed eager, to take questions and comments after they finish. And if you're at home, please put your question or comment into the chat box, and Judy will read them out. For those of us in the hall, please raise our hands in the normal way. We'll start with Laura, who is the curator of the Museum of Richmond. Before joining the museum in February 2021, she held curatorial posts at Christ Church Picture Gallery in Oxford and Dr. Johnson's House in London. She has a BA Honours in History from King's College London and an MST, whatever it is, Master's Studies in British and European History from the University of Oxford. So, yeah.
Hello, everybody. So my name is Laura Irwin, and I'm the curator at the Museum of Richmond. The subject of my talk this evening is our current temporary exhibition, which is celebrating 50 years of the Orange Tree Theatre. And I'm delighted to be joined tonight by Paul Miller, the OT's artistic director. I'm going to begin with an overview of the theatre's history before passing over to Paul to talk more about the theatre's more recent achievements since he began in 2014. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that this isn't really my history to tell. It's probably obvious that I was not around to witness the first show at the Orange Tree in 1971. In fact, I was born in the year that the theatre was already celebrating its 20th birthday. But what's wonderful about a 50th anniversary, however, is that it's been possible to speak with people who were indeed involved from the very beginning, as well as those who've been central to the Orange Tree's activities over the years. With that in mind, we worked with the theatre to conduct around 20 interviews with a selection of writers, directors, actors, staff and associates, some involved historically, some more recently, to help inform the content of the exhibition. It was a real pleasure to be a part of those conversations, and we're very grateful to the people listed on the slide here for their time and participation. Tonight I'm going to read out some quotes from those interviews so you can hear things in their own words, and also you can listen to longer extracts from the oral history recordings, both in the museum, in the exhibition, and in the online version of the exhibition. Okay, so the Orange Tree Theatre was founded in a room above the Orange Tree Public House by two extraordinary local residents, Sam Walters and Oriel Smith, in 1971. It's grown into an award-winning independent theatre recognised on a national and international scale. Often described as a writer's theatre, it delivers a mixture of new plays and historic revivals, and since 1991 has boasted the accolade of being London's only permanent theatre in the round. Whilst conducting these interviews, we were overwhelmed by the sense of affection and dedication that people have to the OT. Lots of people refer to it as being like a family, and reaching this anniversary is clearly testament to its place in the local community. This being the Local History Society, we're going to begin with a brief detour into Richmond's theatrical past. So the first record of theatrical activity comes from Richmond Palace, where performances were given in the Great Hall during the reign of Elizabeth I. It's been alleged that Shakespeare's company played at the palace, though it's unlikely that Shakespeare himself was in attendance. Following the Restoration, there was at least one playhouse on Richmond Hill in one form or another from 1714 until 1769. A new and larger theatre opened on the corner of Richmond Green near Old Palace Lane in 1765. The Theatre Royal Richmond was supported by actors and celebrities, including David Garrick, Sarah Siddons, and Edmund Kean, with the latter serving as actor manager from 1831 until his death in 1833. On the slide, you can see a few images of related objects that we have in the museum to do with Kean, including a spade allegedly used in the gravedigger scene in a performance of Hamlet at the Theatre Royal. You'll all know the Richmond Theatre, of course, which was designed by Frank Matcham and purpose-built on the Green, opening in 1899. The Orange Tree Theatre had rather different origins. Sam Walters and Oriel Smith were both actors by training. They had met, fittingly, whilst performing pantomime in Rotherham. As the actor Vivian Heilbronn recalled, the pantomime was called Dick Whittington and His Wonderful Cat. I was the wonderful cat, and Sam was everything. He was the dancing bear, he was Neptune, and Oriel Smith was the beautiful princess. In November 1971, having recently returned from Jamaica where they had run a drama school, Walters and Smith called a meeting of friends and colleagues in their house in East Twickenham. They formed a theatre group, Richmond Fringe, and began their hunt for a venue. And you can see a photo on the left-hand side of Sam and Oriel on the Orange Tree's 21st birthday. The first pub crawl was unsuccessful, so naturally Walters was required to go back for a second. It was then that he discovered a vacant room above the Orange Tree pub, which was owned by the Wandsworth-based brewery, Young's, with a landlord happy for the extra punters. Described by Walters as a big room with windows on three sides, full of Masonic trappings, sideboards, a sort of spare bar, and a lot of junk, it was perfect. They decided that their first play would be Go Tell It on Table Mountain by Evan Jones, with the first performance scheduled for lunchtime on New Year's Eve 1971. As a club theatre, it was necessary for the audience to have membership cards in order to get a ticket. A launch party was held the night before to distribute as many cards as possible. People were invited via adverts in the local newspapers and posters which the Richmond Fringe had printed with the help of a lady who lived upstairs in the pub. The party was packed, but still, the Richmond Fringe wasn't expecting much of an audience for the next day. The actors were warned by Walters that they would be playing to 5 people and a dog. The day came and over 100 people were queuing on the stairs at the pub, not for the bar, but to see this 40-minute play about politics and race relations in Rhodesia. There were so many people that Walters arranged for the play to be performed twice in quick succession, allowing the overspill to enjoy a pre-show drink in the pub. This was the first of many performances that were heavily oversubscribed. A former trustee of the theatre, Paul Velloway, remembered as an audience member how the first priority on arrival was to get there in time to join the queue up the stairs, waiting whilst clashing a pint of Young's Bitter, waiting for the count to see whether one was going to get in, the heartbeat increasing as one got closer and closer to the little door at the top of the stairs to see whether there was capacity to accommodate one within those pews. The administrator then, Marsha Hanlon, was very good, rather like some people in the Japanese trains, at squeezing more and more people in to make sure everyone that could be possibly seated safely was seated. In its earliest days, the room above the pub had no stage, backstage, or proper seating. Perhaps most notably, it had no artificial lighting, unlike the very dark back rooms of other Fringe venues at that time. But the Richmond Fringe's lunchtime shows were lit entirely by daylight, so the audience was privy to absolutely everything going on. As there were no wings, actors would exit the stage and join the audience. So you could therefore find yourself sat next to quite an unusual stage character, or even a famous actor. The theatre's former administrative director, Gillian Thorpe, for example, recalled how the presence of Tom Courtenay amongst one particular audience in the 80s distracted them entirely from the stage. Walters has talked about how these decisions of necessity broke down barriers between the stage and the audience and led to the theatre later being formally established in the round. As the theatre was run as a club for the first few years, would-be theatre-goers were required to sign up at an office nearby. As Walters described, "You're joining a club so that we can break the fire regulations. So you give them permission to be burnt to death is what you are doing, because we're not compliant with regulations. So we said, yes, you want a ticket, but you can go around the corner and join the club. And on the weekends, when the office wasn't open, we did the joining out the back of our mini traveller, parked outside the Orange Tree." The theatre went from strength to strength and gained a reputation for quality and experimentation. The established playwright James Saunders was a supporter from the very beginning. He happened to live on the same street as Walters and Smith in East Twickenham, and he became the chair of the theatre's Board of Trustees. In 1973, his play, The Borage Pigeon Affair, was the theatre's first full-length play, as well as the first to be performed in the evening. In 1975, Young's paid for the room above the pub to be refurbished into a licensed theatre, complete with heating, ventilation, and fire exits. Individual chairs were replaced by sturdy church pews from a church in Kingston, and you can see those visible in the background on the image on the left-hand side. A year later, an original musical, The Lady or the Tiger, became the first of many Orange Tree shows to transfer to the West End. It was so popular that Marcia Benny, former theatre manager, recalled how people would queue around the block. They'd finally get there and say, "This is my 6th time trying to see it." The director, Anthony Clark, joined in 1981 as a then trainee, and in 1982, he pioneered the theatre's first Shakespeare tour to schools, engaging with some students who had never before been to a theatre. This was one of many community-orientated activities run by the Orange Tree and something that they continue today. 45 Kew Road, the site of the Orange Tree pub, has been home to some sort of hostelry since 1708. The current building dates to 1897 and is easily identified by its brickwork, a style admired by the late Victorians. It remains today a Young's pub, and its name references an orange tree allegedly brought to Britain by Young the brewer, celebrated in the design of its tree-shaped railings on the top floor. The pub's proximity to Richmond train station, both its current and its former sites, lent itself to congregations in the area. The pub was the site of local courts throughout the 1800s and often the meeting point of hunting parties, sporting groups, and political activists. Indeed, in the 1930s, it was one of several open-air meeting spots used regularly by fascist speakers. The pub's theatrical leanings were made apparent as early as 1943, when it hosted the first of a very well-attended monthly assembly of amateur dramatic societies, perhaps a sign of what was to come. It was apparent from the offset that the Orange Tree Theatre needed larger and more accessible premises for its packed audiences. In 1974, a primary school over the road on Clarence Street closed down, and permission to convert the building was finally granted to the Orange Tree in 1987. Theatre Projects, a specialist architectural firm led by Ian McIntosh, was appointed to design an unusually small stage in the round with seating at ground level and upstairs. A huge shortfall of $750,000 was required to convert this derelict mid-Victorian building into a proper theatre. A fundraising appeal was launched in 1988, spearheaded and generously supported by the late actor and producer Sir Richard Attenborough and his wife, Lady Sheila Attenborough. Long-term Richmond residents, the Orange Tree was a cause close to their hearts. The funds were raised through charity shows, through raffles, through dinners, And really, that is thanks to the Orange Tree's established place in the local community. As the Attenboroughs put it, everyone believed that the theatre belonged to them, to the people of Richmond. On the 14th of February 1991, the new Orange Tree Theatre opened to rave reviews with a production of Arthur Murphy's All in the Wrong. The move formally established the Orange Tree as a theatre in the round, where the audience surrounds the stage on all sides. Described by Paul Miller as the oldest form of storytelling, theatre in the round provides a shared space where the audience are embraced as participants. Miller told us that thousands of years ago, in a clearing in the forest, they didn't say, "Now you go over there where you can't quite see us, and we'll stand here and shout at you so you can't quite hear us." No, they gathered around together. And as for the room above the pub, where it all began, it functioned as a second stage until 1997, when it was refurbished into pub toilets. Walters describes how one actress who'd been in a lot of plays there went over and sat on the loo and cried. The theatre has prided itself on breathing new life into old scripts since its early days. Paul is much better placed to talk to you about that than I am, so I'll just share a couple of key examples of historic revivals. One is Harley Granville Barker. In 1979, Barker's translation of Dr. Knock was the first neglected classic to be revived at the Orange Tree. A decade later, the theatre staged the world premiere of Barker's final two plays, which, despite his status as one of the greatest figures of 20th century theatre, had never been performed. But perhaps the greatest rediscovery was Rodney Ackland. A successful playwright in the 30s and 40s, Ackland wrote virtually nothing after an early version of his play, Absolute Hell, was fiercely attacked by critics for its scandalous themes. By the time the first of his plays was staged at the Orange Tree in 1984, many assumed he was dead, when in truth he'd been living locally in real poverty. It was thanks to a chance encounter between Walters and Ackland's social worker in a Richmond department store that Ackland was thrust back into the limelight. Absolute Hell was staged in 1988 and received with astonishment. You can see some images on the slide here of the show and also the cast outside the Orange Tree pub. Within the year, the play was adapted for BBC Two with an all-star cast that included Judi Dench. The tradition of reintroducing underperformed plays has continued under the artistic leadership of Paul Miller, with notable productions of lesser-known works by D.H. Lawrence, Bernard Shaw, and Terence Rattigan. The latter's While the Sun Shines, which you can see on the right-hand side here, has been one of the theatre's most successful shows to date. The Orange Tree has, at the same time, attracted and nurtured new writing. In its first 10 years alone, it produced 89 new plays. I've already briefly described the relationship with James Saunders, but I should also mention other writers like Martin Crimp, David Lewis, and Faye Weldon, as well as more recent new playwrights like Alistair McDowell, who wrote Pomona in 2014, and Brandon Jacob Jenkins, who reworked An Octoroon in 2017. Perhaps the Orange Tree's most significant relationship with a writer, however, was with the Czech playwright, former dissident, and later president of Czechoslovakia, Václav Havel. By chance, in 1976, Walters had become aware of one of Havel's plays, Audience, which the Orange Tree staged the following year, and consequently found itself in the news. That year had seen the founding of Charter 77, a civic campaign in Czechoslovakia named after a document which accused the socialist government of prohibiting free speech. One of its leading instigators, Havel, was tried for subversion and penalized by the Czech government. The Orange Tree's production productions arose considerable interest, and the pub filled with members of London's Czech community. A petition was organised, and the Richmond Fringe marched on the embassy with the playwright Tom Stoppard, who was born in Czechoslovakia. This began an enduring connection with Havel, and you can see some images on here. On behalf of the Czech embassy, the theatre hosted a celebration of the 30th anniversary of Charter 77. And in 2008, it gave the first production outside Prague of Havel's final play, Leaving, attended by the playwright himself. Acting in the round and under a spotlight in such a tiny space, we've been told as part of our interviews, is terrifying for some, but electrifying for others. In a room small enough for the audience to reach out and touch the cast, there is nowhere to hide. Many well-known as well as up-and-coming actors have trod the boards at the Orange Tree and its youth theatre. Some examples include Oliver Ford-Davis, Victoria Hamilton, who you can see on the slide there, and Kate Beckinsale. But again, Paul can tell you more about that. It's been evident through these interviews that there are particular challenges that come with acting in the round, not least the likelihood of audience interaction. We've been told how at the Orange Tree it's imperative that actors keep an eye on who's standing up and sitting down on stage in order to minimise the obstruction of sight lines. The actor Claire Lawrence Moody, for example, recalled a particularly memorable performance of The Distance in 2014, where 8 characters were arguing on stage. Moody's character was so angry with the character played by Helen Baxendale that she intuitively stood up to shout, much to the frustration of an audience member on the front row who loudly exclaimed, "Move over, dear, I can't see." Okay, I'm going to attempt to play this video whilst I talk here. So this is a video showing the setup, the fit out for a play called Humble Boy in 2018. Words and language have always been at the core of the Orange Tree. Productions are generally pared down and achieved with minimal setting and staging, allowing the script to shine. This is also a physical necessity for in-the-round theatres, where large pieces of set can obscure the view. As Stuart Burgess, technical manager, described, "We're not a big West End show where we're trying to do all the glitz and the glam. We're just trying to create an environment for the play. Ultimately, the job is to serve the script." This makes the Orange Tree's floor one of its most important and imaginative tools. In recent years, it has become a living garden, a swimming pool, a black hole, and a giant drain of blood. The production that you're seeing now required 18 tons of sand, gravel, and bricks, and over the course of the show's run, real flowers began to grow and to bloom. Props and costume are sometimes commissioned and made bespoke, and we've got some really fun examples on display in the museum as part of the exhibition. But space and resources have always been at a premium for the Orange Tree. So items were very often borrowed from other theatres or even members of the audience who could supply the right pieces. This extended to loans from an antique shop fortuitously located next door to the Orange Tree pub, which permitted its wares to be used in shows before they were sold. I'll just leave that up for a minute. On the subject of behind the scenes and making the magic, I must say a few final things about the 2 artistic directors who have led the Orange Tree. Sam Walters was at the helm for over 42 years, by which time he had become the longest-serving artistic director of a British theatre. When they retired in 2014, Walters and Smith were awarded Freedom of the Borough of Richmond upon Thames in recognition of their services to the local community. The award is the highest that the council can give and an honour bestowed on only 20 people since 1965. Paul Miller was undeterred by the major funding cut announced by the Arts Council on the very day that he took over as artistic director. He attracted 49,000 people to the Orange Tree in his inaugural season, with nearly 1/3 of the audience attending for the first time. And in addition to that, he has, of course, led the theatre through the pandemic as it launched its first live stream performances and OT on screen. I'll end by describing how the actual day of the 50th anniversary was marked by 6 of the theatre's former key staff and early supporters on the stairs which once led to the room. This is a quote from Marsha Hanlon, former theatre manager, and in the photo there. So on the 1st of December 2021, which was the actual day that the first lunchtime performance happened at the Orange Tree, at 1:15, half a dozen of us from the early years gathered at the pub, sat down with a drink. And after we'd raised our glass, we went and stood on the stairs, going up to where the room was, as though we were queuing to go to that first performance. Gillian Thorpe phoned up Sam. Oriel was on speaker on the other end, along with Sam, and we passed the phone around so we all had a one-to-one, with everybody listening in and raising a glass to the past, the present, and the future of the Orange Tree. And I'll just finish with a plug for the exhibition. Please do come and visit it if you haven't already been in person. It's on show until the end of August. And as I said, you can now listen to extracts and longer extracts from the oral history interviews that we conducted online. So if you follow the link on the screen there, you can do that from the comfort of your own homes. And I will now pass over to Paul.
Thank you very much. That's great. Thank you, Laura, and thank you, everybody. I'm very, very, very well aware that having been at the theatre for 8 years, a mere 8 years, following on from somebody of 40 years' experience who founded the theatre, I am very much still a Johnny-come-lately. So I will honour that by not taking up too much time, but maybe offering a few reflections on what I think we've just learned, and maybe saying a little bit about what I think has happened in the recent few years. I found the exhibition absolutely entrancing. Partly the process of gathering all the information and hearing people's testimonies, but the end result has been fascinating, and I've learned a lot, and I thought I knew quite a bit, but I've learned a lot. And I think even just this evening, something's crystallized for me about it, which is there's something that's been absolutely consistent in 50 years of the Orange Tree, and that consistent thing is change. It's always been changing and changing and changing and growing. And I think sometimes there's a funny thing that happens in memory, isn't there, where we tend to think of a theatre with 2 artistic directors, and therefore, oh, that guy, he did one thing, and then this guy's done one other thing. In fact, the 40 years that Sam and Oriel were at the theatre, as you've just seen demonstrated, were a long period where it changed and grew and mutated a lot, and I'm really sort of fascinated by that. There's one incredibly profound thing, which I think, the story I find fascinating, which I knew from when I first arrived at the theatre, and I made a point of going right through all the productions, box by box, all the materials that there were, including, fascinatingly, all the photographs. And what I learnt was in the 20 years where the theatre was above the pub, there was a developing story that you could see in the photographs of this gathering idea about in the round. In other words, it didn't arrive ideologically in a thunderclap in 1971. It grew as an idea, and it's fascinating. You could see one of the early photographs there. It wasn't an entrenched thing at the beginning. You could see rows of chairs and actors in front, you know. You can see how that developed over time, and you can see it in the production photographs. So that by the time in the 1980s, the kind of golden prospect had arrived of designing your own theatre in a found space across the road. By then, yes, this profound idea of gather round and we'll tell you a story had arrived. But I think it's all the stronger for having been arrived at through 20 years of practice and experience, actually. And so I found that a very valuable lesson, actually, to learn from this process of looking at the exhibition. And I also know that history and the Orange Tree didn't stop changing in 1991 just because it had found its permanent home in the round. Yes, things on stage were developing, and by the way, in the 40 years that Sam and Oriel were programming the theatre, there is literally nothing they didn't do. So trying to pigeonhole them as one thing or another is really impossible, because you only have to open old brochures at random and go, my goodness, they did that. So I also know that the theatre changed even after acquiring the new building, because then at some point they brilliantly got new office space on Kew Road, then at another point suddenly, and this is much under-discussed because it's a kind of under-the-bonnet thing, but an incredible resource to gain that corner site. The so-called bank building, which was a bank, that huge terracotta building, is an invaluable sort of engine room for the theatre, because it gives us the luxury of a workshop and 2 rehearsal spaces. So these are phenomenal things that happened over time and took a lot of time and effort, I think. So I think it's very important to know that. And certainly I can talk a little bit about how things have changed and changed and changed again in the mere 8 years that I've been here. Because the Orange Tree that I came to, I mean, it's so marvellous to see all these old images and hear the stories, and in all the testimonials in the exhibition, you can hear all the marvellous stories about how the theatre grew and professionalised itself. Well, by the time I came along, my goodness, wasn't it professional, like this incredible, important London theatre. But unfortunately, or rather fortunately, the theatre never stops changing. And so in the 8 years that I've been here, we've had to respond and respond and respond again to changing circumstances as the theatres, as expectations of the theatre and its working practices change. And so that's my main takeaway from the exhibition, is that the consistent thing is change. And one of the things I liked in that presentation, which was great, is to see, yes, I totally agree, Absolute Hell was the textbook definitive example of a rediscovery, and I remember it at the time. But it's marvellous that in amongst all the change there is also continuity, and so the marvellous picture of Polly Hemingway in that production Above the Pub is wonderful. Polly then appeared in my first production at the Orange Tree, so there was this, I hope, in a sense of baton passing as well. What I tried to do when I arrived was gather a few strands together and make it a bit plainer to people what the Orange Tree was about. And it seemed to me that the Orange Tree did 3 things really well. But before those 3 things, there's one really important thing, which is I realized that there wasn't space to talk about it here because there's so much to talk about. But Tony Clark starting what's become known as the Primary Shakespeare Project in 1981 was hugely significant, because by the time that I arrived in Richmond, the Orange Tree had what was by then called an education and participation programme, way in excess in proportion to the scale of it as a theatre, which was incredible to have been built up over, what was that, over 25 years. And so partly it was a mission of ours to develop and change and grow that, which we've done. But it has very, very deep roots. And so we now have an Orange Tree community department with a huge number of youth groups and parent and baby groups and over 60s groups, but it all goes back 40 years. But the three strands that I thought that I would sort of just crystallize a bit more and that we pursued is that, yes, there was this really interesting thing about rediscoveries. And so we've done plays by Terence Rattigan, but not the plays you've necessarily heard of, by Bernard Shaw. People had forgotten that he actually did have a sense of humour. So we did some of those. And it's never been the classics. And my attention was always piqued when I would mention a play and to somebody and say, oh, that play. And they'd go, I'm so sorry, I've never heard of it. Right, we're doing it. If somebody went, oh, yes, that's a good one, that one, isn't it? I'd sort of go, oh, no. So we've tried to sort of steer through that. And yes, as Laura talked about, doing new work has been incredibly important, a part of the Orange Tree's history. And so we've continued that. It didn't seem to me, what I think is really interesting about younger artists, and I thought this 8 years ago when I arrived, is that London has an architecture problem when it comes to developing artists. So thank heavens, there's now, contrary to when I started, there's many more opportunities for writers and directors to get something on somewhere and get into the business. There's wonderful schemes and programs and bursaries that you can get. And then what happens? You've done a couple of good things above a pub somewhere, and where do I go? Where do I work before I can get into the Cottesloe, as was? And it seemed to me the Orange Tree, with 180 seats in Richmond, in other words, it's not a black box, 100 seat in the middle of town where everyone who sits together knows who they are and will see you tomorrow at the Bush. It's quite an interesting step forward for young artists, and I thought that, so we sort of entrenched that as part of the programme. And so we do new plays by developing artists, really. In other words, it's very rarely first plays, but it's very rarely plays by fully developed artists. It's a sort of offer that I thought we could make to the theatre ecology. And then something in the middle, which I think is a relatively new thing, is that I had observed, being the relatively old age that I was when I got this job, though I noticed I looked at least 8 years younger there, was that the British Theatre is very good at putting on people's early work and then forgetting them. And so there are a whole load of living writers, actually, whose plays that I was aware of from the 80s or 90s, whose work was busy being forgotten, even though they were still very much with us. And that was, for instance, Mustafa Matura, or Charlotte Jones, or Claire McIntyre, or Sharma MacDonald, who's a local writer, whose plays I remembered so well from the 1980s, and who had acted at the Orange Tree Theatre above the pub. And I would say, oh, Sharman MacDonald, to some younger people, and they go, oh, Sharman who? Sorry, I don't know who that is. So hence we did When We Were Women. So that contemporary revival strand has been really interesting for us, I think. And what I love is those things all colliding off each other and producing sparks sometimes. So that's how we've proceeded. And even in my time, things have changed and changed and changed. We've had to react to the pandemic. We're now, yes, thank you, happily live streaming. And I'm glad we're live streaming tonight, which was something that I wanted to do when I arrived before all the pandemic, because I thought, yes, NT Live is great. You can see the cameras all pointed at the Littleton stage, and the actors are all over there, sort of doing quite big acting, and it's a little bit, if on a bad night, like bad telly. But at the Orange Tree, I thought the cameras would be in the room, and the microphones would be in the room, capturing what was happening in the room, the event itself. The cameras would see the other cameras, they would see the audience reactions, just like you all see each other's reactions through the course of the play. And I know from the time that we've been here, it's been watching the audience is often as fascinating as anything else, and particularly when there's something surprising or contentious about the subject matter of a play, to see people's different reactions, sometimes very different reactions to what's going on, is as compulsive as drama as anything else. And so it's been great to be able to do that in the last 12 months, particularly as, because of COVID, we've had to cancel performances. And what it's opened up for us is actually, it's not a COVID-specific thing. It's a great thing to offer to people because there are all sorts of people who, for all sorts of reasons, cannot always make it in person to the theatre. And so it's a wonderful part of our access programme, we think now. So that is a very, very, very speedy attempt to bring us up to date. My little few years compared to 42 years. I feel a little bit like one of those charts they use to explain life on Earth. Do you know what I mean? Where we arrived at 5 to midnight. Do you know what I mean? So I'm going to leave it there and maybe now open up for some questions.
Right, okay, thank you very much. Laura, would you like to come up as well? And we'll happily take questions. I think you agreed 2 excellent thought-provoking presentations, as they're clearly very obviously keen to take your questions and comments. So let them come forth. Please try to keep them short, because I hope a lot of people will have things to say.
I've got one question on Zoom, and that's from Hugh Jones, saying, very interesting talk, thank you. Is there anything you would like to change in the design of the theatre?
Could I answer that? I think the theatre is magic. I think the auditorium has a touch of perfection to it. It's inspired. And I think it's a brilliant... The reason I think it's a really good place for younger artists to work is because you are forced to work figuratively. In other words, it makes a profound statement about human life. The human figure is literally at the centre of the action. So it's like being made to draw at art school. If you can do that, then you can do anything else. But if you can't do that, you'll wobble with anything else. Where I have slight more issues is that I feel now that generally theatre-goers' expectations of theatres require a little bit more of a physically easy way into the theatre. And I think having to go up steps is very difficult for a lot of people for various reasons. And so I'd quite like to reduce the number of steps.
Right, Andrew at the back.
Just on the pandemic lockdown, how did you survive? I mean, you mentioned Zoom and all that sort of thing. And did you do Zoom programs? And how did you get your money in? Did you get grants? Or?
Yes, I can answer that very, very simply in one way. Partly due to the support of everybody, a lot of people here, I suspect, and also Richmond Council. But absolutely crucially, I must, hand a lot of credit to the government, to the DCMS, and to the Arts Council for the Culture Recovery Fund. And we were the very fortunate recipients of money that prevented us going bankrupt, and we're only here today because of it. And I believe that the reason they gave us such staunch support is because of the description of 50 years' work you've just seen. But it's down to them. And to the people who lobbied so successfully for such a big overall amount of money. And that was a behind-the-scenes operation, which I know a little bit about. But it was a brilliant thing. So you won't hear me say anything against the government.
Right, check.
What's the average demographic?
Yeah. Yeah.
Ah, yes.
Yes. Sorry. Yes.
Hello. What's the average demographic of your audience now? Because so many theatres find it very hard to get younger people.
Yes, it's true. Thank you. There's a very boring answer to that question, which is the way we collect data on audiences has changed over the years and is very difficult because, of course, we don't, require people to fill in their demographic details before they're allowed entrance. So it's a little bit difficult to track. We know from the number of first-time bookers that come to the theatre that the audience is changing. It's very clear that every London theatre-going habits build over time. It shouldn't be a surprise to anybody that it's entrenched when people are a little bit older and children have left home and money isn't so terrifying. It's not a surprise that theatre audiences are demographically a little bit older. And that's as true at the Orange Tree as it is anywhere. But that doesn't make it any more of an interesting challenge to make sure there are people who we're sort of putting the seeds of that habit into and bringing them forward. So it's an ongoing thing that every theatre has, a sort of a dynamic that's at work in every theatre. But I think it's pretty clear that it's changed quite a lot. Just you can tell night by night at the Orange Tree over the years, and I love it when it's a genuinely mixed audience. I don't want one kind of audience and not another. My biggest thrill is when it's genuinely mixed in all sorts of ways, because that's when a certain magic happens. Do you know what I mean? Because plays are responded to in a very electric way when there's a mix of people in the room there for very different reasons, from very different places, different ages. So it was one of the proudest things. I mean, I know Alistair McDowell's Pomona wasn't necessarily for everybody, but Alistair said to me afterwards, he said, the audience of Pomona here was the most diverse I've ever had, and he meant it in the true meaning of the word. And I was very proud of that.
Right.
A couple of questions, one for Paul and one for Laura. For Paul, have the themes that the new writers have chosen, have they changed over the course of your time at the Orange Tree Theatre in terms of topics and interests? And then for Laura, how has the Orange Tree Theatre worked with the Richmond Theatre in the sort of ecosystem of theatres around here?
You want to go first, because I've been speaking a lot.
Yeah, sure. So I will start by admitting that I don't know very much about the Richmond Theatre. I mean, certainly now I know more about the Orange Tree Theatre than I thought I would ever know. I suppose just going back to my talk, in that the Orange Tree's origins were very organic or natural, in the sense that it was founded by obviously Sam Walters, Oriel Smith, the two of them, with a group of other like-minded thespians, former colleagues, actors, a number of whom lived in the local area as well. So it was a very Richmond institution from the beginning. But it was not in a purpose-built design space until 1991. It was, I suppose, a grassroots organisation in that sense for a long part of its history. And the Richmond Theatre, I know much less about, but I do know was designed, obviously, and purpose-built for the space that it's currently in, and so had a very different kind of original fruition.
Yeah. All I would observe about that is that Richmond's very fortunate, because just like in cinema terms, it has the Odeon and the Curzon. We've got the Richmond Theatre and the Orange Tree, and I think the two are analogous in some sort of way. You wouldn't want just the one. In terms of how writers have responded differently over the 8 years, I suppose all I'd say, is that, on the one hand, they've reflected what's going on in society and politics, and so what's called identity politics, rightly or wrongly, has sort of been reflected quite a lot. Though I should say, because I'm busy choosing the plays that you see, it's as much about my choice as anything else. Rightly or wrongly, I've tended to, I think plays should be about things. I think a good play is always about something. I tend to shy away from those plays that advertise what their politics are, and that slightly old-fashioned kind of new writing where two people come on and talk about what the play's about. We don't tend to do those, do you know what I mean? So the politics are often implicit rather than explicit. And so that's a taste thing of mine, I guess. So I think things have changed, yes. And one of the things I'm quite pleased with is that we've managed to do so many plays by women, and actually made that more strongly, habitually entrenched in who we produce. And going back to, it's not just, and that's not just about new plays either. When I was talking about those plays from people who are still with us, who are being neglected, that's often women. They often make a success with a play that people go, oh, that play's great. And then, oh, they get sucked up into television. Now don't have the time to write for the theatre. Then the television stops putting their series on, and they find they've got no home at all. And that was very much true of, say, Charlotte Jones, whose play, the set of which you saw being built in slow-mo there, Humble Boy. She had that huge hit with Humble Boy, but had been basically elbowed out of the British theatre. And so that was a big moment, actually. There was a story behind doing that play, not just because it's so good. Ooh, lots of hands.
Laura, can you tell us a bit about the community engagement that's come out of the exhibition?
From the museum side, well, I suppose from both, as Paul just added as well to the presentation, one of the pioneering things about the Orange Tree was its early education and participation programme, so bringing Shakespeare into schools from the early 80s. But we do a similar kind of work at the museum in that we have a fairly extensive learning programme that is inspired by the subject matter of the exhibition. So we have family activities as well as tours and summer school workshops for younger students. So those are based on themes from the exhibition, the idea being to share and to teach ideas about theatre, about performance, particularly the in the round focus, so working with younger students and family groups they'll do things like create their own set boxes or model boxes, think about how to perform, again, within an in the round space rather than front on. So we do a lot that is inspired by the content. As well as now we've produced this online version of the exhibition where you can hear the oral history recordings. The hope is that those audios will also be deposited at the archive in Royal Holloway University, which is where the Orange Tree's own archive, so it's photographs, it's administrative archival materials, invoices, some things more exciting than others, photographs in particular, letters, scripts, that's all now deposited at the Royal Holloway archive, so it's hoped that audio and also some of the materials produced as part of the exhibition will end up there too.
Thank you. Judy, any more comments from Razoo? Okay. Any further comments or questions?
We better wait for that.
Who are the people, who are the sort of stars that emerged or early on in their careers who performed at the Orange Tree Theatre? Were there some?
Yes, well, I mean, there's been many over the years, and but it's really interesting that they often come through not just ordinary productions, but having worked behind the bar or in particularly the youth theatre, and coming to being part of the primary Shakespeare project. So, and that goes on right to today, because there's some people who, because the youth theatre groups have always in my time, they've grown to run between the ages of at that point 7 and 16. People had gone right the way through their youth at the sort of Orange Tree School of Motoring, really. So even now, there's somebody who's in the business of becoming a major British film star called Finn Whitehead, who was the boy at the centre of Dunkirk, if you saw that. Well, he's from the Orange Tree Youth Theatre. So it's bang up to date, that story. And so that's what I think we're very, very proud of. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. Mind you, on one other point, just going back, I suddenly thought, I was there in the 80s, and I can't think, unless anybody else can, of a pub theatre that had an education programme. No, name me one in London. There wasn't one. Only in Richmond.
If we've finished, thank you very much for 2 really brilliant talks. I've learnt something, a lot actually. I must get to the orange tree. Are you going to? The question you're going to be asked is: are tickets on sale, and what's the next production coming up?
Tickets are on sale. Tickets at all prices. We've got a press night on Wednesday, a really seriously brilliant play called Tom Fool, which is fantastic. Then we have a new play coming up after that called The Misfortune of the English. True story. And then I'm directing a Marivaux play called The False Servant. So there's something for everyone. Tickets at all prices. Yeah. Okay. Book online, on phone. Yeah.
And what's coming up at the museum?
So from September, we'll have our next exhibition, which is with the Poppy Factory, who are celebrating their 100th anniversary this year.
Brilliant. Okay. Well, if you like to put your hands together. Thank you.